Thank you for tuning in to the Healthy Project podcast, My City, My Health series. Don't forget, tickets are now available for the My City, My Health Des Moines. Visit mycity.health to register and join us for an inspiring and informative event. A big thank you to our presenting sponsor, Unity Point Health, for their continued support. Welcome to the Healthy Project podcast, My Health series, where we give voice to crucial health topics discussed in this year's My City, My Health conference. I'm your host, Brooklyn Laurie, and I am so excited today to be joined by Kenya. Kenya, thank you for joining us today. If you want to give us a little introduction about yourself before we start.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Brooklyn. Kenya Caledon, I join you to talk about the immigrant experience and some mental health uh, topics that, immigrants in Iowa are very familiar with or may not be familiar with. I am currently a student at Drake University. We were just joking that I can't wait to be done and graduate later in December. And I also work in the financial services industry. So I'm excited to be speaking with you today.
Thank you for that. I feel like that's one thing we can definitely bond on as being a Drake University student. Go Bulldogs. So we have so much to
Absolutely.
talk about today. I have lots of questions for you. First, I want to begin by kind of talking about mental health a little bit. I did see that you said you received a PTSD diagnosis. Can you kind of go into just your immigration journey and how that could have played a role in your mental health?
Absolutely. So I am a huge advocate for mental health services inclusion of immigrant and refugees because I myself migrated to the United States when I was 11 years old. And at the time, I didn't question our move. I didn't question why my parents were making that decision. I trusted that they knew best for myself, for my siblings and I. And it was a pretty traumatic experience, as you know, uh, we crossed the border, and as a family we arrived to Iowa, and I grew up experiencing a lot of things that I just thought they were normal. One of those was um, day nightmares every single night about death, and I just thought everybody walking on earth just that's just a normal experience until the nightmares got extremely bad. I think it was the fear of death was heightened during uh, the COVID pandemic in 2020. So the nightmares got so bad that I ended up um, going to see a therapist. It was all online, and um, receiving that diagnosis of PTSD, it just made my life make more sense. And it came with, and we realized in therapy that it was because of the traumatic experience of crossing the border at 11 years old, constantly living in fear in the United States, and just always worrying about my family and I. But surprisingly enough, once I got that diagnosis, the nightmare stopped. And I think it's because somebody finally articulated what my experience was. And it liberated me to know that it was not normal, but that I could do something to improve my mental health.
Mhm. That was beautifully said. I think I can speak for a lot of people when I say that receiving a diagnosis can definitely be a form of relief in being able to further understand what it is that you're going through. So I am so happy for you that you were able to receive that diagnosis, and I am sorry that you had to go through that. I think that that's very difficult to experience as a young child, and so I'm that is very unfortunate, but I'm glad that you got that diagnosis. Do you think that being an immigrant, you had any barriers or you had to face any barriers in receiving that diagnosis?
Excellent question. I think my biggest barrier was the fact that therapy is not something that many immigrant households talk about. It's not something that we saw our parents experience or go through. And it actually, the pioneer in my family was another cousin of mine. She's younger, but she was the first one out of all of our cousins or our family to go to therapy. And so it was seeing her set an example for the rest of us that made it almost okay for me to seek help as well. And so I thank her for making it normal for our family to see. We never received any negative comments about people that sought therapy. It was just something that we just didn't do until she normalized it for our family. And I think since her, all of my cousins that have an immigrant story have gone to therapy or actively in therapy thanks to her. And so I think the biggest barrier was for me not knowing how beneficial it would be at an earlier age.
Yeah. Let's all work together in normalizing therapy because it is so beneficial. And I think I've also talked to some other people, and that's definitely a common thing is the view of therapy and kind of it not being normalized in certain families. And so I'm curious, moving further outside of your family, do you think that other immigrants receive those same barriers that you had?
I would say from what I've heard from other people in my community is I feel very lucky because I didn't receive negative comments about therapy. But I know that there's some immigrants that have a negative view on therapy. I think religion has a huge role in those in that perception. I grew up and I'm also a practicing Catholic, so I know that even within certain religious group, the religious groups that there is a belief that you can just pray away the pain, that you can just heal by connecting closer and becoming closer to God or in whatever that belief system is. And so I've definitely seen that, and I've seen how there's youth in the immigrant community or children of immigrants that have not gotten the help that they needed because there was that belief that was told to them that you could just pray it away. And so that is something that is an active concern among our immigrant community. How do we challenge um, that perception while still respecting people's religious belief for them to know that those two things could live hand in hand. You don't just because you go to therapy does not mean that you don't believe that your religious beliefs and practices could also be a form of healing. So I definitely think for immigrants, one is just challenging those religious beliefs. And then the other challenge too is that, especially in Iowa, mental health resources are not accessible uh, to immigrant populations, let alone in other languages. So I know there's many, I would say, many immigrant parents that know that they need help, that they know that they may be drowning in depression or in anxiety, but finding a resource or somebody that they can trust in their language is extremely difficult in Iowa.
Yes, yes. And it's cultural competency. That's super important because with a varying culture as an immigrant, you need a healthcare system that caters to your beliefs and how your lifestyle and your environment and what route you prefer to go down when it comes to treatment. And so that in itself is so important. Again, cultural competency, language barriers are so big. And so much so have people with language barriers had to rely on family members to translate for them. And that in itself is a whole other issue. How do you think healthcare systems can be better improved to serve immigrant communities, whether that be cultural competency or language barriers?
I think that removing the language barriers is one. One way to do so, making sure that we have resources and people that can actually speak the language of the communities that we're trying to serve. But I think it's going to take a while before we can build that personnel. We can build the bilingual personnel. It's gonna start at the high schools, making sure that we know that or that we can tell our youth that they can find a career in mental health services. But as that takes some time, we need better training. We need cultural
Mm-hmm.
competency for the people that are already in the field. So, I, as I mentioned, I'm a huge supporter of therapy. But I also am a person that I will advocate for myself. And, I'm the oldest in the immigrant household, so I will advocate myself when I need to. And I had to stop seeing some therapists because I felt that it was the entire time that I was spending with them was me educating them for free.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's nothing worse than being in therapy, trying to talk about or trying to dissect what you're experiencing, and not even getting time to do so because you're too busy explaining
Mm-hmm.
the education system of the United States. And that's what happened with my first therapist. And I'm really surprised that I didn't get disencouraged to stop therapy as a whole. I just remember thinking, I'm not going to sit here for 50 minutes and explain what DACA is to a therapist, right? And so I think just making sure the providers today do their own learning on by themselves or through some sort of training before they see us, because we can't spend the entire time educating somebody. That's not our role as a patient, um, or a client, right? So that's what we need today in the short term.
Right. Right. I think that's so important. A lot of people think that when you are assigned or you find a therapist and you start going to therapy, that you're kind of stuck there. And I think even just beyond having to feel like you're educating your therapist on how you should be treated, but also just not even having the right relationship that you're looking for in a therapist. What advice would you give other immigrants who are also going through um, that event with their therapist?
So that's an excellent question. I would say that I didn't come up with this. I'm not the one that said this first, but uh, therapy is almost like dating. So you have to be okay with breaking up with people.
I've heard that.
Trust me, I have no trouble. I have no trouble doing that. So, uh, so, um, so knowing that just because somebody is not working out does not mean that all therapists are going to be the exact same. So I um and the most perfect example that I could give you is that I spent 2 years with one therapist, and she was after the negative experience that I had with the very first therapist. Um, I spent 2 years with her. We talked about my childhood trauma. We worked through the PTSD diagnosis. And then it got to the point where I could feel that we had hit a spot that we weren't making progress anymore. So the
Mhm.
moment that we started talking about my adult life and adult relationships and navigating those type of relationships, she was not we really weren't on the same page anymore. But I can I can acknowledge that she was great for my childhood trauma um, phase of my therapy, but it was time for me to find somebody else that could get to know me as an adult and not necessarily me as my inner child. And she understood that completely. And I think she also agreed with me when I made that change. So knowing that there's different therapists for different stages of your life and what you want to discuss, and know that if you hit a place where you feel like you don't want to go anymore or you start to reschedule appointments, it might be time to find somebody else that can provide you with a different perspective. And that is completely okay.
Wow, that is amazing that you said that. I think different phases in your life are so different. And the same way we move through each phase with different important people, in the same way you have different friends and different priorities, it's also important to know that you can have different therapists. And so I'm so happy for you that she was able to help you work through that phase. But that you were also able to acknowledge that once you kind of hit that block and there was no more growth for you there, that it was time to move forward and find somewhere else where you could grow. So I really appreciate you for mentioning that. So I'm curious, with all your work and advocacy, how you still maintain your mental well being while also prioritizing advocating for others.
Excellent question. So I think I've been advocating, or I've been in the immigrant rights advocate space for going on 12 years. No, since 2012. So yeah, almost 12 years. And I have learned the hard way that I have to be very selective with how about my capacity. So when I first started in the advocacy space, I was everywhere at all times. It was insane. And I was very unapologetic about sharing my immigrant experience, my immigrant journey to the United States. Um, and I remember it got so bad that I gave a speech in front of 200 people. Uh, and it was a speech to get high school counselors to be more culturally competent.
Mhm.
And I remember I got to my car after the speech, and I didn't know that this what I was experiencing was a panic attack. At the time, I just thought, wow, like that was really heavy for me. But I remember sitting at a parking lot of this conference and just having a full on panic attack and having to drive back home and pretend that that didn't just happen. And so now, in my 30s, I'm very selective. I don't share my story in detail as I used to before, especially when I can feel that I'm not in the mental space to do so, because I don't want to trigger anything like that I used to experience in my earlier years in my advocacy. But I know now that I know that I'm good when it comes to legislative work. And so anytime my contributions could benefit my community, I come out of retirement is what I call myself, knowing that I can only give that space of myself and not try to push the boundaries because I know that it can get me to a very dark place that I don't want to go back to. So it's just really having those boundaries set for myself that has allowed me to continue to advocate for my community to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's such a key component in prioritizing yourself and maintaining your well being overall. I think it's so important to not give more energy than you have. And it takes a lot to learn that. It really does.
I think for some, when it comes to advocacy, our ego is involved in a lot of the things that we do. So also being honest with myself that for me to think that others can't rise to the challenge is also it's my ego speaking, right? So knowing that just because I'm not in a certain space does not mean that things won't get done and allowing others to step up to the plate too
Yeah.
has helped me be able to say no.
Wow. I never actually thought about that. Do you mind going deeper into that? What do you mean by your ego has kind of taken over or is involved in that?
So, as I mentioned before, I was everywhere at all times as a younger advocate, activist, what have you. And um, the thought behind it, or my belief was, well, if I'm not there, it's not going to get done well. Or if I'm not there, I'm
Mhm.
failing my community.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I started to do a lot of like self work and reflection to know why where does this belief come from that others are not capable of doing what I was going to do or probably even do it better, right? So the moment that I realized that I wanted to be an intentional leader, I have to realize that I have to create the space for others to lead when I'm not there. And so that means taking a back seat to a lot of different movements and knowing that I can't, I'm not some saint, right? I can't do it all on my own.
Hmm.
Uh, but there are people in my community that I should trust to be able to do the work and be okay with that and be okay that just because my face, my name is not involved, that I'm okay with that. And so that's also that's making sure that I check my ego at all times to make sure that I don't take up space where I don't need to. I hope
Wow.
I say well the way that
Wow.
I had.
No, that is moving because I have that same belief that you first mentioned that if I don't do it myself, it's not going to get done, or nonetheless, it's not going to get done correctly. And it's hard to take the back seat on that and just truly trust that it's going to be okay. Do you have any tips for moving past that?
Say, I think it comes with years of experience and getting to be in a place where, um, and I see that with a lot of college students that are actively involved in their college campus. So as I mentioned, I also went to Drake for my undergrad, and so I was involved with like 5 different organizations.
It's the
And
Drake busy.
yes, absolutely. And I think it also happens, to people in our communities are involved in so many different nonprofits and movements. So as we navigate white spaces, people of color or other minorities can find themselves being pulled in so many different directions. And so you get used to getting and I'll be very honest, getting that high of feeling needed or getting that high of feeling important, right?
Mhm.
Because we haven't been seen in such a long time. We haven't been asked to be part of these dialogues, right? So we get used to it and we want to hold on to that feeling at all times. And so the moment that we as leaders realize that that's not healthy, that's when we start to check ourselves and see, do I want to be part of this truly because I am needed? Or do I want to be part of this just because I'm used to this feeling of being a voice? And so once we come to terms to that, I think we can finally move on to say and really be selective about where we need to be. Not
Mhm.
only for ourselves and for our own preservation, but also to make sure that we don't run into becoming the only one in those spaces and really allow for others to be part of those dialogues too.
Yeah. I think you really set the example for that because I don't think I've ever thought of something like that. And so I think we also experience imposter syndrome a lot. And I think that also plays a role in just wanting to be a part of everything or not knowing what you should and shouldn't be a part of. So I thank you for mentioning that.
Of course, I think the hardest part when we are leaders as it relates to mental health is also addressing the parts of us that are not so pretty and acknowledge and really say these things out loud. And I've actually had this conversation with another Latina activist that we kind of grew up together, and we both talked about how it can get to your head, and it's you get to a point where you're leading from an ego and not
Mhm.
necessarily uh, from a thoughtful place. And so, just I think therapy has also allowed me to not be afraid to say these things because they're more common than we actually realize.
Yeah. So, moving on to kind of talking about more of your policy work, I would love for you to kind of give us the rundown on what you do relating to health policy. And then I've got a few questions for you regarding that because I did find that I don't remember the time frame, but you were going live on Instagram and educating communities about certain health policies. And so I am just dying to hear about that.
Absolutely. So I think there is an intersection to health with so many aspects of our life as it relates to housing, public safety, and for immigrants is the ability to live in a state that does not persecute or that doesn't try to be a federal agency and carry out their mission, right? And to
Mhm.
truly just be what it is. And so um, along my journey of advocacy, I just became very knowledgeable and about the legislative process, the state legislative process. And so I am actively paying attention to whenever there are any anti immigrant bills that try to pass through the state legislature in Iowa, because I know that any form of persecution for the immigrant community will impact their health. So, as I mentioned, I was dealing with PTSD long before I knew what PTSD was. And so, just like me, there's hundreds of, maybe thousands of immigrants in Iowa that have made Iowa their home um, for decades. But at the same time, I know that they are probably still very fearful anytime that they leave their house because they don't know what's going to happen, right? When they make their way from their work to their children's schools and whatnot. So there is that intersection with mental health, making sure that people see the state as their home and feel safe in Iowa. And so, whenever there's any type of legislature that would threaten that piece, I know that it impacts my community. So, I utilize or I've leveraged social media to educate people that are around my age, to get them to move towards action. Because a lot of times we have parents, aunts, and uncles that are undocumented and out of fear, they can't be involved in the legislative process or in the political process, but their children can. And so that's why I try to make that information as accessible as possible so that somebody that's 25, 27 can learn about the legislative process and how a bill becomes a law in Iowa and take it back to their families to explain that to them and hopefully minimize that fear that could happen because of these bills.
Wow. So there was some personal experience kind of that was driven from that. Okay. Yeah, wow. So, what policy changes do you think are necessary to better serve the health resources for undocumented immigrants?
I would say if I could have if I could make the perfect state, if I could make the perfect state, let's get Iowa to be in a certain different place, I would allocate resources, financial resources to expand these services. So, on the undocumented population in Iowa are taxpayers. They pay um, billions of dollars across the country into federal and state taxes. And so, but we rarely see the benefits of the money that we're paying into taxes. So there has been states like California that have expanded um, their medical care benefits to the undocumented community. And so I don't know that Iowa is there right now, but if I could
Mhm.
live in a perfect state, it would be a state that funded resources for immigrants, regardless of their legal status.
Okay. And do you think organizations would be able to also get behind this and further advocate? And how do you think they would be able to do that?
I think we can try. I just think that regardless of the party, I just think that we are not there yet. I don't think our lawmakers are there to a point that they can acknowledge immigrants as human beings and acknowledge the dignity of immigrants. And so I think organizations, we have nonprofit organizations that are actively advocating for services to be expanded to immigrants, regardless of their legal status. Um, but we need lawmakers to see immigrants like the important part of the community that they are for the state first. And if not, I think we need younger people that, again, regardless of the party that they belong to, we need younger people to start to see like themselves in those positions to be able to be inclusive of different communities in our state. So we're probably a few years from that taking place, but I'm confident that we will have more people that will start to see politics not as such a scary thing or such a divisive thing to be part of, but as a tool to make sure that people get the resources that they
Exactly. And that's where advocating is going to come in. So
need. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
so. I want to backtrack a little bit because I do remember you saying that you became very educated in being able to understand the moves that laws were making and just being able to keep up with legislation. How did you do that? How can other people get further educated in that?
Absolutely. So I would say that I had a mentor. So I had a mentor at a very young age. I might have been 20 when I met her, so almost 10 years ago. And she really made that information accessible to me. And so I think something clicked in me to know that state policy is moves faster than federal policy does. And so it just I became like extremely interested and I started to ask more questions and do my own research about it too, because all of it is available online, right? It's just making sure that once you get an interest of a topic, that you seek out mentorship, that you seek out nonprofits that are working in that
Hmm.
those spaces, and just actively continue to learn more. I think I'm learning 10 years into this work. I'm still learning something new every single time a legislative session starts.
Yeah.
And so I think it just happened because I had a mentor that sat down and explained it to me in a way that it was accessible to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And not a lot of people have that resource or that ability to do such a thing. So and I'm sure a bunch of other people really appreciate you using your voice and you using your brain because you have the ability to do that. So I really appreciate you doing that. I'm curious what unique, like health or just in general challenges do immigrants face specifically in Iowa?
Great question. I think immigrants, regardless of how long they've been in the state, are very separated um, from the programs and resources that take place in the uh, that are available to them. So it really comes down to making sure that organizations do grassroots outreach to communities and build trust among immigrant and refugee communities. Um, I I would say so. I'm going on almost 20 years living in Iowa. I think for the first 10 years, my family and I lived a very isolated life. So I
Mhm.
grew up over on the northeast side of Des Moines, and uh, their life, my parents' life was going to work, going to church, and spending time with us. There was really not much outside of that. And so it wasn't until we got older, my siblings and I got older, that we started to learn more about resources and different programs that we could benefit from. And so I'm often thinking about the immigrant households that have young children right now that could benefit from group counseling or that could benefit from um, free health free health screenings, but they don't know that that's taking place in their city because the outreach hasn't been done. And
Mhm.
so um, I just think about the need for organizations to actively build relationships with immigrant communities because word of mouth is huge. And so the more we foster word of mouth among um, these the communities, the more people will see come and actually take advantage of the resources that exist to them.
Yeah, of course. Communication, collaboration, outreach, all of those are of necessity when it comes to being able to get the resources and the education out there, especially in underserved and immigrant communities. That's so insanely important. Do you have any current projects you're working on when it comes to advocating for immigrant communities?
That's an excellent question. I would say not active right now. I was very active earlier in the year with the legislation that came out. So there were four bills that would have hurt our immigrant community a great deal. Only one of them passed through the entire process and was signed into law, but it was blocked by a federal court last week, so it will not be going into effect on July 1st. So I would say my role right now is just following the information that immigrant rights organizations in the state are putting out there, and knowing that I probably will have to come out of retirement once again in January once the new legislative session starts, because I'm sure that just because those bills didn't go through this session, they will most likely try be introduced again. So just actively paying attention to um, political platforms of the people that are making the laws in the state is very
Mhm. Well, Kenya, I will keep up with your work. I'm excited to see what you continue to do in the future. And those are all the questions that I have for you today. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to hear what else you have to say for this year's My City, My Health conference. You're joining us for our immigrant health panel. So I'm really excited.
important to bring a different perspective for for the attendees. It's one of my favorite conferences of the years, and I think everyone will benefit to hear different experiences because mine is just one. So my experience as immigrant is going to look very different than somebody else's, and so I hope that that panel motivates others to start to brainstorm ideas as to how can they ensure that immigrants and refugees are included in any of their planning and outreach. So I'm very excited, and thank you so much, Brooklyn. You did an amazing job, and I look forward to connecting with your work with the Healthy Project as well.
Thank you so much, Kenya.